Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Teach Middle East podcast. I'm Lisa Grace, and today I have the great pleasure to welcome Mary Myatt, and she is here to talk to us about how we can dig deeper and get rid of some of that clutter. We're going to do this podcast Marie Kondo style. We're going to kiss it, we're going to show gratitude, we're going to get rid of it, and the rest we're going to pack them neatly and keep it tidy. Mary will introduce herself, but this is season 3 of the Teach Middle East podcast. Before I jump in, I want to say welcome back and thank you so much for sticking with us, for being such good listeners, such good audience. We really appreciate you. And welcome, Mary, to the podcast.
Well, hello, Lisa Grace, and I'm delighted to join you for this, talking about one of my favorite subjects about how we can catch back some of the stuff we do in education. So delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please, can you give us a brief intro of yourself?
Yes. Sure. So my background is secondary religious education, and I taught in London and Cambridge, but for the most part of my career, I was just outside Ipswich in Suffolk. And beyond religious education, I've also taught some English, some history, a little bit of maths, some PSHE and some Latin at lunchtime. And then I joined the local authority in Suffolk, general school improvement, but also with responsibility for religious education. So that meant supporting newly qualified teachers, as they were called then, running conferences, network meetings, producing curriculum materials, but then also the legal aspects of religious education in England. We have separate bodies called Standing Advisory Councils on Religious Education, so I supervise that as well. And then I left the local authority about 10 years or so ago, and since then I've been working in schools, talking to pupils and teachers and leaders about learning, leadership and the curriculum. And for the most part, I've been an invited guest in schools, but for about 4 years, 3 or 4 times a term, I was there on inspection. So I've done work across early years up to Key Stage 5, including special educational needs contexts. And what I've learned from that is that the principles of high quality practice and provision, they're underpinned by the same ideas, by the same values. So on the back of that, I do share examples from across different phases where I think there's a message for all of us, even if we're not working in that particular context. And then in order to clarify my own thinking, I've written a bit, and 1 or 2 people have found that helpful. So that's my background and what I currently do.
Thank you so much. Brilliant, brilliant. I want to jump straight into the pod because when I actually got familiar with your work, I was reading your blog actually, and you did a blog post about how we need to declutter education. And it resonated with me on so many levels because I've always said when we are adding, we never seem to ever consider taking things off the plate. We're always sort of piling things on. And when I led schools, I remember that pressure to always be looking for the latest and greatest and always be adding stuff. Why do we clutter so much in education, Mary? What's the reason?
Well, I think the main reason is because we're very diligent as professionals in the education sector and we want the best for our pupils and students. But I think this hits not just our systems and processes, but also the curriculum. And so that's why I think we have to take a hard-nosed look at what is actually serving the needs of the learning of the youngsters that we're working with. And if they're not, to be brutal about cutting them back. So there are 2 main threads to it, systems and processes, and then also the curriculum.
And when it comes to cutting back, why do schools find it hard to even cut back on things they know aren't working?
I think it's largely habit. And that's why I think we have to approach some of this with careful curiosity and with a healthy skepticism, which is different from being cynical. But I actually ask questions are these really working, or are we just doing them out of habit? And I think certainly in schools in England, and I think many other jurisdictions as well, there's a perceived need that I have to produce certain things for an audience. So in England, that might be an inspection regime, Ofsted, or for governors or trustees. And that can be helpful, but it shouldn't drive the agenda. And so continually asking, is this making a difference to pupils and students?
Yeah, and in your experience, right, when you go around schools and what kind of resistance do you get when you start to talk about fewer things in greater depth? What's the resistance that you're met with?
So I think there are always going to be some trade-offs, because we'd love to be able to do everything, but we can't. And so, people are just going to keel over if we just keep adding more and more. So if we're going to do something new, then we have to be disciplined. And this is Greg McCown's insight on essentialism. We have to be focusing on just a handful of things that are really going to make the difference. And we'd like to do more. And this is where the tension comes in, but not everything can be a priority. So, for instance, what I'm finding, for instance, in some schools is that, every piece of work has to be marked. And we know from Dylan Williams' work and others that most marking in most books isn't making a difference. Feedback live in the lesson does. And, there is a place for marking, but this idea that every piece of work has to be acknowledged by the teacher, it's not making a difference to children's learning. So I get some pushback on that by saying, well, senior leaders need to see it. Well, my main audience is my pupils and students. If senior leaders can't work out what's going on, there's some questions around there. So what I've found when I'm, for instance, doing a book scrutiny with senior leaders, I'll say, what are you looking for? And they say, we're looking to see if the books have been marked. And I say, fine. So now, as we go through these books, can you tell me what difference that marking has made? And they say, oh, well, we're not looking for that. Well, I say, it's just a redundant exercise then, isn't it? You just want to see a pen on paper, but it's not making a difference to children's learning. Then you're asking your teachers to do something which is basically a waste of time. So when you look at a lot of the feedback that is on children's work, it's quite often great work, well done, Johnny. It's like, that's not moving him on. But then some of the pushback against that is, well, teachers sometimes say, well, it's a form of my affirming the children and building relationships. I just think, well, I think they know how you feel about them, what your attitudes are, just from being in the classroom. You don't need that extra thing. Then if they've given some feedback, say they've spelt something wrongly, you see whether the child has spelt it out correctly or not. Most of the time they haven't. So the teachers put something they should do and then they haven't done it. And then I've regularly seen feedback where the teacher's given a really thoughtful response and the child has just written, cheers, miss, or thanks, sir. It's like, again. And so, we think we really do need to think hard about this because it's really just performative. And, just a final example in that, in England, it might not be happening elsewhere, but certainly for children in younger classes, you see verbal feedback stamps as proof that I've had a conversation with the child. Hang on a minute, the child knows I've had a conversation with them and they've then done this. So it's not that we don't look at children's work, we do, but a lot of that will be taking place in the classroom. And then when appropriate, it might not be every lesson, we just skim the books and see if there are some common threads coming through, and then we teach those from the front. And so it's actually much better for children's learning, but actually it saves teachers time as well, using things like whole class feedback sheets. So it's quite complicated, and part of it is ingrained habit, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dig in a little bit, right? Because the whole thing that caught my eye from your article was that whole analogy with Marie Kondo, who I watch a lot of on Netflix, because I might be like a slight little hoarder in my own life, so I need to find inspiration, so I watch her. Um, and her thing is really to look at what you have and to think about whether or not it's serving you, and if it isn't serving you, to get rid of it. So we're going to link that back to education. And I wanted to think about what are some of these other performative things that you see us doing in education, whether that's in England or, as our context is, international schools across the Middle East. But they're very similar, trust me. The teachers come from the UK or the States or wherever, and the habits and the practices come with them, and we don't really change much. We just change location. So what are these performative things that you see? You just talked about marking. What are some of these other things that we need to kiss goodbye to?
Yeah, so I would say we need to have some tough conversations about the data that is collected in schools.
Mm,
Not that we dump it completely, but basically we need to be thinking about information. And so what's been an issue in English schools has been the completion of data performance tables to prove that children have made progress based on numbers or the number of skills that they've allegedly shown that I can tick off on my key performance indicator and turn that part of the spreadsheet green. You know, that is not an accurate portrayal or analysis of how well children are doing. So the bottom line is external tests and examinations, we can make some judgments about standards of the children currently in the school, or the schools that have, the children that have just taken those tests and examinations. They've usually moved up a year. The reason we can do that is because those external tests and examinations have some validity and some reliability. Nothing is 100%. And so but we can talk with some confidence about how well children have done. And the reason for that is because hundreds of thousands of pupils and students are taking the same paper based on the same curriculum, and there is moderation around it. It's never perfect, but we can talk with some confidence. Those conditions don't apply when we're doing the same in school, particularly if we're using the criteria from the public tests and examinations, because we're only doing it with a small number of children. So that's when we start getting into a muddle, and my concern there is that we then get backwash into curriculum provision. So just to give an example, for 11-year-old students in a school in England, in order for children to do well, supposedly 5 years later at the GCSEs in England, they're given AQA language paper 2 type questions to answer in the mistaken belief that's going to get better results 5 years later. It's the backwash into the curriculum that is so unhelpful. What children need in order to get great results 5 years later is a really rich, demanding curriculum that is going to really make them think, help them to learn deeply, and then the results follow. And so it's this backwash into curriculum impact that is of great concern. That being said, we can make some judgments about whether our children have learnt what was intended. And here, Tim Oates, who led on the review of the national curriculum in England, which was published in 2013 with implementation in 2014. And in England, that only needs to be followed by maintained schools, local authority schools. But what we find in practice is that the schools and multi-academy trusts and schools around the world that are following an English system, they tend to base it on that. And certainly in England, if they are not basing it directly on that, they need to show that it's at least as ambitious as the national curriculum. So Tim Oates talks about, given that levels and progress measures have gone in England, but we've still got to make some judgments about how well children are getting on. He talks about having a look and considering the things that children produce. What is it as a result of what I taught my class that they are doing and producing as a result? And so that might be some written work. It could be a short essay, it could be an extended essay. It could be what they say. Because frankly, if they can't talk about what I've been teaching them, they haven't got it. So I've got to go back and do it again. It could be the result of low stakes quizzes and tests, can give us some indication. And then it could be something they produce. It could be an artifact, or it could be a speech, or it could be something that shows what they know, understand, and can do. So the bottom line we need to be asking, instead of these sort of pseudo data, is I've taught this curriculum, I've taught this unit. Have my children got it? And how do I know? And what am I doing about the children who've not got it? So in a way, it's much simpler. However, it doesn't sit neatly on a spreadsheet. But I've been in lots of schools looking at data, both on inspection and otherwise. And I've also been a governor in 3 schools and a trustee of a multi-academy trust. I've never been presented with a set of data that is telling me anything meaningful about standards currently in the school. You can only do that by actually looking at samples of children's work. And the final thing I'd say in relation to that, the distorted practices and assumptions that are made about using GCSE criteria for students currently in the school, or the assessments at the end of year 11 for the SATs in England, is that they were never designed to be used in schools. They were designed to be used by the people who are marking them. So they're unreliable. They're not fit for purpose for use in school. That's the bottom line, the argument that I'm making. But if you talk to someone like Daisy Christodoulou, who is a world-leading expert with her colleagues at No More Marking, comparative judgment, for instance, is a much more accurate way of making judgments about standards of pupils in schools. And we can use that methodology just by looking at samples of children's work across, across a unit and saying, is this reasonable? Is this what we would expect? And what's the range? Which ones are stronger and which are not? When we work in that way, we are developing far greater insights into what constitutes good work, particularly if we're having these conversations with other people, which we really ought to be if we're being line managed and held to account for how well children are getting on. But also we gain greater insights into what high quality work looks like. So that is a summary of my position, for instance, on the misuse of data.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear that, because I think what schools worry about, though, is if they don't collect and present data in the traditional way, then they won't be able to evidence that which the inspectors are looking for. So for us to say to the inspectors, this child has really come a long way in their writing or in their reading, or the literacy has improved, we've got to show them, numbers. But really what we ought to show them is samples of work. This is where this child started, and now this is what the child can produce, and then this is where the child should be really going. This is where we're working towards. It's very hard to show that in spreadsheets. It's very hard. So it's kind of a catch-22, is what are the inspectors looking for? And then how can the schools present that? There's a disconnect there. And I don't know how we'll be able to connect that, because true meaningful data cannot be shown on a spreadsheet in numbers, and that's where the problem is.
Yeah. And so, if we're looking to show the progress that pupils and students have made, and we're using external instruments for that. So for instance, reading tests, so YARC or GL or PIRA or PUMA for some mathematics, we can use that kind of data, because again, you've got a population of pupils and students, hundreds of thousands, all taking that same test. So those are useful because we can show that standards are rising. However, they're limited in terms of sometimes the papers that are set, the children haven't covered that bit of the content yet. But we can nevertheless extrapolate from that. And of course, we don't do them too often because A, they're expensive, and B, they don't tell us any new information. But most schools have some form of external check for certainly English and mathematics.
Yeah.
And you can see that. It's the other subjects that don't have that external stuff until you get to certainly 16 or so.
Right.
Now, it's certainly in England, the inspector at Ofsted are not looking to discuss internally generated school data, because they've realized, all the arguments I've been making, it's not valid or reliable. So they will talk about the published data, and they'll talk about, are there any extenuating circumstances? There always are, because it's a human process, and some children might have left and others arrived. So we just have a commentary around that. But then in England, they're not looking to see internally generated school data. What they are having discussions about is what's the intended curriculum? So what is it that children are going to be taught, say, in history, in primary or Key Stage 3, 11 to 14-year-olds in England? What's the overall of that? And is it has been carefully thought through? Is it sequenced? Is it building on prior knowledge? And how do we know whether children have learnt what was intended, which takes us back to the samples of children's work and also talking to pupils and students as well. So in fact, the methodology that I've just described is actually the methodology for inspection. So when we're talking too about governors, then I think it should be the same thing as well, that we just show them samples of work and we might focus on the individual meetings where they we look at one or two subjects, so they're getting that deeper insight that takes you beyond really what is a nonsense numbers.
Yeah, yes. I think for international schools, they do look at those external results, but not all schools do the GL. Not all schools have that measure of external grades. And so it's not exactly the same as it is in England. And so you find that they are presenting internally generated grades on spreadsheets for as evidence for inspectors, and it does throw up a lot of problems. But I want to take it away from data, and I want to look at our in-school practices, and look at what are we cluttering up there. Let's talk a little bit about teacher observations, because there tends to be now in international schools a push on constantly observing, which then brings a lot of sort of angst and anxiety around the teachers. How can this be done in a Marie Kondo style way that we're getting to the heart of what's essential?
Okay, so it's important that leaders know the standards of teaching generally in the school, obviously. Lesson observations that are graded are not an accurate representation of that. Professor Rob Coe from Durham University, and plenty of other evidence has shown that you cannot make a judgment just by spending 20 minutes in a lesson. So there are two things I would say in relation to this. Anyone who is coming into my classroom, I expect them also to be teaching.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh. Well, that touched a nerve, because majority of the school leaders in the Middle East who are conducting observations don't, I wouldn't say majority, I would say a big number do not have a timetable. They do not have a teaching timetable. They don't teach. They are administrators solely. So that touches a nerve. Wow.
So we have the same in England, but what a lot of senior leaders and head teachers do as a matter of principle, they will have a class, because that consolidates credibility, but also it means people can come and watch them. So it's got to be a mutual thing. And the other thing I would say is that what appears to have most impact are light touch learning walks, but they mustn't be graded, because grading is, again, for all the problems I've said, and people self-identify with the grade instead of thinking about practice. So what a number of schools are doing now in terms of supporting teacher development, teacher practice to get better, and that's basically everyone in the sector, myself included, is a very careful, deep program of instructional coaching, for instance. So we're moving practice on in this very precise, almost atomistic way, where we work on something that is going to improve practice, and we practice it, and then we nail that over time, and then we move on to the next thing. So it's a highly collaborative, but also it needs to be done with great humility on the part of the person who's doing it. It needs to be a lot of training around this. But that is supporting practice, rather than someone just landing in my classroom and giving me a number at the end of it and saying vague things like, you need to get your questioning better, or, whatever it might be. That is not helpful. So it's a complex piece of work. And then the other thing to say is, even if senior leaders have not got a timetable class, I know that some regularly put themselves on supply, to cover a class. So again, they're still in there, and they've got lots of other things to do, but actually this is our core business. It'd be a bit like a doctor saying, I never practice medicine, I just supervise others. For me, that is really important. They obviously can't have a full teaching load, but I think in order for this to really work, they should be doing a bit of teaching themselves.
No, that's a really good, and I hope this resonates with our audience because I do know that a lot of the things we hear is around, oh, I'm being observed and I'm being given a grade, and the person who is doing it is not a teacher or hasn't taught for a while. Then maybe they were a teacher, but they haven't taught for a long time, and how do they know and how do, you know? The other thing I wanted to talk about is because I know within the schools in England, I think it's a little bit different, but in international schools and in private schools, in we are initiative overloaded. And that's because we have to compete against the school down the road. So if you're a fee-paying school, and most of the schools, especially in the Middle East region where we serve, are fee-paying schools, right? And they're privately owned, so they're businesses. And the school needs to stand out from the other schools. And so they have a million and one initiatives going on all at the same time. How can they declutter this and still have what we call an edge over the next school? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so if we try and do too much, then nothing gets done properly or really well, and also we get exhausted. So I think it's more helpful to think about how can we be the best possible professionals in this setting for these pupils and students, and don't worry about what other people are doing. I mean, keep an eye on it. So if we've got no music provision, for instance, in our school, that is a pretty fundamental thing that children should have as an entitlement in any case. But if it's stuff that is trying to set it out in a marketing point of view, you know, that the best kind of marketing is just having a really good product and service. And to do that in a really deep, thoughtful way in a context where everyone thrives, and that includes the adults. And so, you know, yeah, deep reflections from senior leaders who are making some of these judgments, because there can be the tendency, you know, just to keep adding more and more in order to be distinctive. But actually, the distinctiveness is a much quieter, deeper, more thoughtful piece of work, where we're not trying to be all glitzy and all singing, all dancing to appeal to the widest audience. Because actually, people can spot that. They know whether their pupils are getting it, their children are getting a good deal. You know, is this place deeply committed to the needs of the young people serving? Is the curriculum really rich and beautiful and interesting? And are there sufficient additional cultural and personal opportunities for children as well? And I just wouldn't overcomplicate it more than that.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. I think quality sells, not quantity, right? And so if you're offering a quality education, it doesn't mean that you have all the fancy bells and whistles. It means you're really giving value, and that value comes from the commitment to. So, yeah, brilliant. All right, some quick fire questions, because we are, oh my God. Every time I do a podcast episode, I think my listeners are very used to me going shock at the timing. I can't believe this is meant to be 30 minutes. We're now at 30 odd minutes, but we're just, I need to ask these questions Marie Kondo style. I keep saying Marie Kondo style, but really, if you had to throw one thing out from every school right now, what would it be? Like, no school should be doing this.
Oh, no school should be, you know, producing masses of worksheets and downloading poor quality resources from the internet and thinking that's a curriculum. Now, underpin it by beautiful texts and, you know, and so we have just too much stuff, what I call Jackson Pollocking the curriculum. So I'm just going to pull out more and more and throw it at my pupils and hope some of it's going to stick. So this is a real example of fewer things in greater depth. Let the text, as Andy Tharby says, be the beating heart of the lesson, when we want children knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. But then that's separate, obviously. This is a kind of knowledge element of the curriculum that's separate from children, you know, making things, constructing things in practical elements of their learning. But really really casting a really beady eye on, is this beautiful in the sense that it's adding value to children's learning?
Yeah, are people still doing worksheets? I'm just like, I thought that was like a bygone era. But if it is, yeah, definitely throw it out. Okay. Now, a school leader has listened this far into the podcast and they are thinking, okay, what can we start to do to make sure we're doing fewer things in greater depth? Where do they begin? What's that process like? Help them, talk them through that process so that they can now, because this is the start of the new academic year, they want to do things right. Can you help? How can they start?
So the first thing I would say is this is not a quick fix. This is an iterative process over time. But each of us will have a hunch that there's something that we are doing that doesn't feel quite right and we're wondering why we do it. So I would start with that and say, is there a way that we can either refine it, cut it right down, or even get shot of it, just say goodbye to it. And not to do it on our own, to talk with colleagues and to ask them, are there things that we are asking you to do, particularly from an administrative point of view, that really feel burdensome? Now, if the leaders can justify why it's needed, that is fine, because then colleagues will understand the purpose of it. But if we can't justify why it's doing it, apart from another adult audience, then we've got to think, is this really adding value to children's learning? So I would just go through some of the systems and some of the processes and just say, can we make this simpler? Can we make it more beautiful? Not in an aesthetic sense, but in terms of high quality stuff that we offer children. And then how are we going to go about sort of communicating to people that that is now going to be the process we're going on? Because we don't just chop everything at once. We iterate with it, we see what happens, and then we cut it down the road. So that would be my advice, not to try to do it all at once, but we all have a sense in our hearts that, oh goodness, we're just doing this because we've always done it. And so just to start there.
Yeah, so I think the thing I liked about what you just said, and it's a good place I think to end the podcast, is to make sure it's a collaborative process. Don't just unilaterally go and chop things. And if some things have to stay, then really communicate the why so that people know, exactly the reason they're doing something and can buy into it and really work with it and carry it on. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, I just finished with one caveat in that the only thing that's absolutely non-negotiable is safeguarding.
Oh, yeah.
Beyond that, we've got to have our safeguarding principles in place. Those have got to be absolute watertight. Beyond that, everything I think is up for negotiation. Let's just have a look at it and keep it, because we've done that spring cleaning, Marie Kondo. We can justify why it's there. Otherwise, we get shot of it. I hope that's helpful.
That is really, really helpful. So ring fence your safeguarding, make sure it's watertight, and then you can start looking at everything with eyes of, really, do we need it? Can we get rid of it? Or can we even make it more effective, efficient? Because it doesn't
Exactly.
mean you have to throw it all out. Maybe you could streamline it and make it more effective.
Exactly.
Okay, brilliant. How can we reach you? How can we reach you in the Middle East? If people want to work with you from the Middle East, do you go out? Do you come out here? How does it work?
So yeah, my website is marymyatt.com, and there's a contact on the contact section. So people can email me there.
Do you come out to the Middle East any at all and do trainings with schools or?
I have done in the past on Zoom, and then I was going to come out, and then there were the lockdowns. So most of my work now internationally is on Zoom, but I'm not able to take on any more commitments for the time being because of all the projects that I've got already going on. But you can see those, that what I'm working on, online courses, cohort-based courses with John Tomsett, various other pieces of work, and they're on my website on the contact page.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with me, Mary. It's been a real, real pleasure.
Oh, Lisa Grace, it's been so good to chat with you, and I hope everyone has a great start to the term.
Fantastic.